Kim in Oregon, who believes there's some evidence for God.
Cool.
Hi, Kim.
I hope it's good evidence, because I would agree if we're going to include testimony that there's anecdotal evidence. But what kind of good evidence do we have?
Right. So first off, I just want to say this is a new thing for me, so I apologize if I fall over myself. But yeah, so a friend of mine wanted me to call in. I don't usually do this, but I'm not a typical Christian. I don't buy into, I'd say, 80% of what Christianity pushes.
Okay.
But I do believe in the Bible. So
hang on, Em? So I'm going to let you continue, but there's two things I'm going to be curious about. One is, what is the criteria for you determining which portions of a religion you accept and which portions you reject? But if you say you accept the Bible, what does that mean? Does that mean you accept everything in the Bible?
Well, that gets into the weeds, right? Because that's what denominations become. What I believe of the Bible.
Well, it has nothing to do with denominations. I mean, I'm saying the Bible legitimately says things that aren't true, and it also legitimately sanctions and allows things which aren't moral. So I just need to know what you mean when you say you believe the Bible, and which Bible.
Right, and you'll go right. I get that. So I guess to the first, I forget your first point, but I guess to the question of, do I believe in the Bible? I believe, first of all, I believe there's a God, right? And I have to go through that foundation, because if we get into trying to determine what part of the Bible is true, then it gets into very denominational.
Is all of your evidence biblical?
No.
Do you have any extra biblical evidence?
Right, so that's kind of what I depend on, because the Bible, like the
cool, go for it.
And Bill Nye. Okay.
I'm happy. I just want to be clear, Kim. I'm happy for you to make whatever case you want to make. It's just that before you start down that track, be aware that I'm going to be asking what your methodology is that allows you to pick and choose what you want. And I want to know more about this, because if you say, I believe the Bible, I mean, that carries a lot. Like, do you believe the earth was created in 6 literal days? And do you believe it was 6 to 10,000 years ago? Are you okay with slavery? But if your primary goal is to show that you believe that there's a God, go ahead. What is your case for God?
Right. Okay. Yeah. And real quick on the cherry picking, I do believe that as people, kind of like what the show stands for, like, that's why I kind of appreciate you guys being so objective and willing to talk to anybody, because Christians aren't like that. They don't want to bring up any other belief typically. And I think that's kind of what we all have to do. So I do look at the Bible and I have to cherry pick. Not say this part is not true in that part, but I have to determine, first of all, is the Bible true, and what out of all the other books. But so regardless of the Bible, that's getting in the weeds, because we have to even establish that we believe the Bible's true, which we're going to pretend like we're not there yet. Okay. So I would say, just from history, you find an island full of pagans. Typically, the first response is there is something, right? That is an instinctual reaction.
Sir. No, Kim. Have you not heard of the Paraha? No. You haven't heard of the Paraha?
I'm just saying the majority of civilization.
Okay. I don't know what the majority has to do with anything, because in order for something to be true, and you want to try to use the fact, basically right now you're arguing that pretty much everybody has some sort of gut feeling or impression or leans towards the notion that there is a God. And that's just not true.
Right. I wouldn't say a feeling.
And even to the extent,
I don't have any gut feelings towards any of this.
Well, even to the extent that it's true, that people feel a certain way, that is independent of whether or not it's actually true. The Paraha are a tribe, I believe, in the Amazon, where Christian missionaries went to engage with them. They didn't even have a God concept at all. They were baffled. And by the way, the Christian missionary who went down there is no longer a Christian. The Paraha are a prime example that, despite what people want to claim, not everybody, not every culture has a God belief.
Yeah, that's fair. So, I mean, I didn't know about them, but I would believe there'd be some exceptions to that. That's not my basis. So I'm sorry I brought that up.
I get it. No, just what's the case for God?
Okay, so I would say just if I came on an island and I saw the law of, even if I didn't know about the law of entropy, I would deduce that symmetrical flowers or my two eyeballs not being a little off center or there being some sort of purpose that's actually working, that species can intersect and create new babies that are freaks, that there's something going on, that there are walls and boundaries and rules, almost like a program that is making everything function to a certain extent, which screams design to just
No,
me,
sir.
even if I
No.
didn't have anyone tell me.
It doesn't scream design.
It doesn't scream design. The fact that there's order in the universe doesn't mean that the order was intended. The fact that there are mechanical processes doesn't mean that those mechanical processes were the result of a decision by a thinking agent. There's nothing about chemistry.
On its own, it doesn't.
On its own. What else are you adding to
But-
it? What else are you adding to it? Because it seems that what you're adding to it is a God.
No, what I'm adding is the law that I can observe every day, which is the law of entropy, which my room's a mess right now. And
Your room being a mess has absolutely nothing to do with the law of entropy. Nothing.
Well, can I
So
get
the second law of
perspective on it?
thermodynamics states that the total energy in an isolated system can never decrease over time and is constant if and only if all processes are reversible. Isolated systems spontaneously evolve towards thermodynamic equilibrium, this state with maximum entropy.
You
How do
being
you
messy.
get to that
Right.
by observing?
Well, let's say I didn't know that law at all. I don't care what they determine it. I'm just saying off of observation as a person.
That was
and
my
even within
question.
The last 300 years.
How do you just by observation get to that?
Get to that the law of entropy is true?
How do you get to that from just observation? That is the question.
Right. So that's what I was kind of basing on, is that any chance, if I shake, something in a bottle, it's broken up.
That's a closed system.
You never bet that it would ever. Yeah, let's say it's a closed system in a jar.
So
And so
Kim,
let's
Kim,
bust it open and we just put.
Kim,
Yeah.
Kim, you're missing this. You said that you could observe it every day by looking at your messy room, which has absolutely nothing to do with entropy. Then when asked, you talked about shaking a snow globe type thing or some other sort of closed system. But
Right.
do you think that scientists, when they were
Mhm.
sorting out the laws of thermodynamics, did it just by observation? That they looked at a snow globe and said, yep, here's a law of nature. And by the way, you shake up a snow globe, it doesn't trend toward chaos. It trends towards stability. All of those little snowflakes in there trend toward, boom, stopping.
Right. And you don't
Well,
have
it's not-
closed systems. If we go back to your, wandering onto an island without knowing the laws of thermodynamics, that island is not a closed system. It is in fact open because it's getting energy from the sun. So it's not a closed system. Your snow globe is not a closed system.
Because you're shaking it from outside.
And it's also gaining energy from, if it's outside the sun, if it's inside, then it's picking up and exchanging energy with your air conditioned, house or wherever it happens to be. That is still not a closed system. So in order to say that that in an isolated system, isn't the first thing you have to do is figure out how to isolate a system?
Right. Well, this is just one of the pieces, right? I mean, as if we were in a courtroom.
That's not an answer to the question.
Point, right?
Isn't the first step to say
there's no point to
that
get to?
Yeah. The second law of thermodynamics states that the total entropy of an isolated system could never decrease over time. Wouldn't the first step to proving that part of the definition correct to create an isolated system?
I mean, you'd have to create an isolated system and a non-isolated system and compare the results at a minimum.
Right. So how do you do that? How do you create an isolated system? By just observation, by sailing onto a deserted island. How do you do that using your example?
Right. No, that's fair. I mean, I would say that the universe, closed system, open system, to me is just it's for one, even in that same instance, you can't prove evolution, right? We can't observe evolution happening.
Where did we get evolution from?
What the hell are you talking about?
We're talking about the second law of thermodynamics, and you're bringing up evolution completely out of the blue? Come on.
This all builds on that, because that's my belief of a God.
We're talking about
your belief.
Second law of thermodynamics. How do you get there by just observing?
You're saying your belief in a God has something to do with not being able to, second law of thermodynamics not being compatible with evolution? What?
Well, I don't care about the law of thermodynamics. I'm just saying that's what they call it.
Then why did we spend all this time? I promise you, I'm trying to maintain my zen, and Jim's going to lose his long before I am.
I've already lost it.
So why the fuck did we spend all this time talking about the second law of thermodynamics, only for you to say you don't care about it?
Right. And so first of all, we don't even know if the universe is a closed system. However, it may be, right. But what we do know is that our planet is not a closed system because it gets energy from the sun. And so when you look at any system, even a closed one, there could be areas that act like a closed system and areas that don't, as the energy transfers and moves, because it doesn't necessarily move at the same rate. So the second law of thermodynamics does not prove God. Right? It doesn't prove that evolution is not possible, because the planet on which evolution is happening, that we know of for sure, ours, is not a closed system. It's getting energy from the sun, at least energy from the sun, less energy from other places, maybe depending on how you want to look at it, but definitely not that. So this is the second law of thermodynamics. This is what we're talking about. I don't understand, and let's go back to what your original statement was, which was, if you sailed onto an island, you could determine the second law of thermodynamics. And I'm saying you can't prove that you can do that just by being on a deserted island. How do you do that? Because that's what your claim was. That's what we're talking about. Let's leave evolution completely out of this.
Okay. Okay, so that's fair. I would say that my observation would be disorder is the natural flow of things, unless a lot of energy comes from a design
how do you determine that?
Thinking person.
How do you determine that?
So that was kind of
whoa, hang on. Did you just say unless energy comes from a thinking person?
Unless energy comes from a purposeful or forward-thinking person. Energy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but all of the scientific models about energy have nothing at all to do with whether or not that energy comes from a thinking agent. Energy doesn't need to come from a thinking agent to be a function of.
No, I agree.
A thermodynamics. So why did you bring it up? Every single time. It's like you hang on.
To get order.
Hang on. It's like you spew forth something that you hope makes sense. And then when Jim and I, ooh, that's a good thing, point out that it doesn't work that way, then you diverge and go off somewhere else. We've gone from the second law of thermodynamics to a brief interlude about evolution. And now we're talking about energy needs to be added by a thinking being. You don't seem to have any sort of real foundation in how reality works. And yet it seems like you're trying to make use of science to prove something that science cannot prove. Science can't prove God. There's nothing within science.
Science can't prove God.
Good. So thank you, Kim. If science can't prove God, why the fuck are you talking about science when we asked you about God?
Well, I'd argue it's the same for, we can't prove evolution. Right.
We have proved evolution. Evolution is an observable fact. Evolution is an observed fact. The theory of evolution by means of natural selection is the model.
There's more evidence for evolution than there is for gravity.
But in any case, it doesn't matter. Evolution is irrelevant. Even if we couldn't prove evolution at all, you came in to tell us why you believe in God. You spend all this time on science, and then you wind up agreeing that science can't prove God. So why are you wasting our time?
I don't mean to waste your time. I was trying to build my premise on my observation and how it would come to it naturally. But
right, and we immediately jumped on your first mistake, which was second law of thermodynamics.
But you can't come to it naturally. You can't prove God through science, which you already agreed with. So what was the point?
Well, if we're going to go into proving, I would say that's the whole point of what I believe in God. If he proved himself, then there'd be no point to faith. And that's the whole point of
now you have demonstrated that your entire God proposition is useless and worthless.
Yeah,
because basically you're now in the position of saying that you believe something. And while most people would look at it and say there's not enough evidence, your new claim is if there was enough evidence, then that would prove that it wasn't true. But since there's not enough evidence, that makes it all the more true. I mean, that's just bizarre.
Yeah.
You should write down your model. You should write down your model and see how many other gods and supernatural things you would have to accept if we went with your model.
Yeah. And also do yourself a favor and actually study the entire second law of thermodynamics in detail and don't just read answers in Genesis. Thank you very much for your call. I hope that helps. Have a nice day.